I worked for a pastor who had two favorite sayings. Now, Pastor Bill, this pastor, was in his 70s when he said this, so you have to picture this. He said the first thing he always liked to say is, he said, if I have to do cartwheels across the stage of the church in order for people to find Jesus, I will do that in a minute. His second most favorite saying was, his role as a pastor was to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Now, lucky for me, in 2020, nobody's comfortable. And so I really only have one job. To quote one of my kids, they say this: COVID straight up sucks. And the murder of George Floyd has ignited a newfound rage against the problem of racism. And we've seen the elevation of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen protests. And then finally, the most pressing issue of our day: to mask or not to mask. There's a lot of anger around this issue. And although I'm disappointed, I'm not surprised. Our brains like to make sense of things. And when it can't, it causes all kinds of stress and anxiety. I look at our society and honestly, I'm having a hard time making sense of much. I've always been interested in the political process, the formation of government, etc. I have voted in every federal and provincial election that I've been eligible to for the last 30 years. However, over the last 15 years, I've become more and more disenchanted with political powers and parties. And I don't think the process is just middle-aged grumpiness. I feel like there's not a party for me. While each party has a number of good policies and platforms, they also have many policies and practices that I, as a follower of Jesus, find distasteful. Why is that? Well, bluntly, all human philosophies of justice and equality fail when they're compared with God's justice, as laid out in the Bible. And so tonight, I want to take an article that I'm going to summarize from, and the article is A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory, which I have linked to our Facebook group and which I have included in our MailChimp, and we're also going to put that up in the website section, in our blog section. Every part of our society is clamoring for justice, but the question that needs to be found is, what justice? Or what constitutes justice? Even our churches, there's a conflict on what is justice. From a disconnect from the traditional evangelicalism to the adoption of secular justice practices by millennials and Generation Z. The culture war in our society has also crept into our faith. And it doesn't have to be this way. My call to you today is for unity under the banner of Jesus. In order to define what justice is, it's extremely important for us to understand restorative biblical justice. Restorative biblical justice is not just picking the best parts from secular justice perspectives. And there are four main secular justice perspectives. There are the justice as it relates to freedom, justice as it relates to fairness, justice as it relates to happiness, and justice as it relates to the distribution of power. And we'll be looking at each one of these in the coming weeks and talk more about justice. But in order for us to embrace restorative justice, we need to think differently. And here's what Paul told the early Christians, and we read this earlier in the gathering, but I want to go back to Romans chapter 12, just specifically verse 2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so let me give you the 5 characteristics of restorative biblical justice according to this article. The first one is this. Restorative biblical justice is about community. Others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. And let me read this quote for you. The righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. The Bible depicts the human world as a profoundly interrelated community. So the godly must live in such a way that that community is strengthened. We actually see a great example of this in the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 24, verses 17 to 22. And it gives instructions that landowners and farmers are not to harvest every grain, grape, and olive from their fields. They're actually deliberately supposed to leave some for the poor to gather and to pick. And in fact, the English word that is, what the words that are translated in the English say, shall be for the poor. But in the Hebrew, it's actually attributed to ownership. This means that in God's eyes, the amount that he instructs the farmers and the landowners to leave actually belongs to the poor. And if the landowner harvests it, he is actually stealing from the poor. And so this means to treat all your profits and assets as individualistically as yours is mistaken. Because God owns all your wealth, you are a steward of it. The community does have some claim on it. Nevertheless, it is not to be confiscated. You are to acknowledge the claim and voluntarily be radically generous. This view of property does not fit well in either a capitalistic or socialist economy. And so the second characteristic of restorative justice is equity. Everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. And again, if we look in the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 22, it says this: you are to have the same law for the foreigner as for the native born. Racism is not permitted anywhere in Scripture. Not in the Old Testament, not in the New. There's a Hebrew word. It's Mezraim, which means equity. And in Isaiah chapter 33, verse 15, it says, those who speak with equity, or Mizraim, keep their hands from accepting bribes. Bribery is unjust because in commerce, law, and government, it does not treat the poor the same as the wealthy. Any system of justice or government in which decisions or outcomes are determined by how much money the parties have is a stench before God. Another example of inequity is unfair business practices. Leviticus 19 talks about unfair wages. And in a free market society like ours, each of us bears this burden. There's a tension between finding the best price and encouraging unfair treatment of workers in trying to find the best deal. To cut corners and to provide an inferior product in order to make more money, but not serve customers, is to do injustice. The third characteristic of restorative justice is corporate responsibility. I am sometimes responsible for and involved in other people's sins. Sometimes God holds families, groups, and nations corporately responsible for the sins of the individuals. Daniel, in the book of Daniel, repents for the sins committed by his ancestors, even though there's no evidence that he personally participated in them. How does this apply to us? Well, if you're a Canadian of European descent, you probably have benefited from hundreds of years of injustice against Indigenous people groups. Now, did you intentionally break the treaties or write dishonest treaties? No. Did you participate in the residential schools? No. But because we have shared in the benefits, we need to repent and help fix the problem. So I got together with a friend of mine, Kyle Mason. He's a Christian. He was a pastor. He ran federally for the NDP in Winnipeg's North End in the last election. He's a person of Métis background and heritage, and his father was actually in a residential school. Kyle is thoughtful and Kyle's opinionated, which is exactly what I was looking for. And I asked him, in light of the focus on racism, what should I tell my church community? He said, firstly, use your position of influence to inspire change. In other words, because I'm a white, cisgendered male, I am able to speak to people that would ignore him if he is not. Secondly, educate yourself on the history and the news from an Indigenous filter as well as your other sources. He pointed out that the CBC News app actually has an Indigenous news section and encouraged me to check it out from time to time. And thirdly, he says, find an issue you can speak to and use your educated platform and go for it. And so he told me about the schools that are on the reserves in Canada. And he said they are funded about 60% of what is needed to provide a quality education. And because it's on the reserves, it's federal funding, not provincial. And it's been going on for years. The result is Indigenous students are not getting a full or fair education. He has heard numerous stories of students who were educated at reserve schools who have graduated with the equivalent of a grade 9 education elsewhere in Canada. University is tough enough with a grade 12 education. And so this sounds like a corporate or national sin issue. It is a relevant example of institutionalized sin. Socially institutionalized ways of life become weighted in favor of the powerful and oppressive over those with less power. Once these systems are in place, they do more evil than any one individual within the system may intend or even be aware of. Fourthly, when we're dealing with restorative justice, we have an individual responsibility. I am finally responsible for all my sins, but not all my outcomes. And here's an example of this. The Bible does not teach that your success or failure is wholly due to individual choices. Poverty, for example, can be brought on by personal failure, but it may also exist because of environmental factors, such as famine, plague, or just sheer injustice. So we are not in complete control of our life outcomes, but we do need to deal with our own sins. And so despite the reality of corporate responsibility and evil, the Bible insists that ultimately our salvation lies with what we do as individuals. Deuteronomy 24:16 says that in ordinary human law, we must be held responsible and punished for our own sins and not those of our parents. We are indeed a product of our communities, but not wholly. We can resist their patterns. The reality is that corporate sin does not swallow up individual moral responsibility, nor does individual responsibility disprove the reality of corporate evil. It's a both and. And finally, restorative justice practices advocacy. We must have a special concern for the poor and marginalized. While we're not supposed to show partiality of any kind, we are to have special concern for the powerless. This is not a contradiction. Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9 says this: "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." The Bible doesn't say speak up for the rich and powerful, not because they are less important as persons before God, but because they don't need you to do this. And so this is why you can and should be able to say, Black Lives Matter. The playing field is not level, and if we don't advocate for the poor, there will not be equality. In this aspect of justice, we are seeking to give more social, financial, and cultural capital to those with less. Jeremiah 22:3 says this: "Protect the person who is being cheated from the one who is mistreating foreigners, orphans, and widows." Jeremiah is signaling out for the protection of people who cannot protect themselves from the mistreatment the way others can. And so here's what I want you to know. Firstly, all the references on biblical justice that we use today are from the Old Testament. And this is important for us to embrace. The Old Testament is usually associated with wrath and punishment and God firing lightning bolts at people who are doing wrong and that you get what you deserve. However, an examination of what God required from his people in the nation of Israel was a culture of justice. And their sins as a nation and what they were held responsible for was as much about their inequity as it was about their pure living and idol worship issues. This allows for a congruence between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, who we see as Jesus. We can say that no society is righteous if it is full of injustice. Secondly, biblical justice is a personal and corporate responsibility, and we must use our resources, our positions, and influence to make justice a reality. And going back to this quote, it sums up beautifully how it works. The righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. In order to achieve justice, it is going to cost us each something. And finally, we have all been influenced by secular justice models through our upbringing, through our education, and through the media. And while each one of these models would have platforms that would agree with biblical justice, not one of these is a model and a suitable model for what biblical justice is. They all have parts that take us away from what biblical justice is. And so you need to be aware, and you need to be able to ask yourself, what do I believe that is inconsistent with biblical justice? And more importantly, where do I have to extend grace to others who disagree with me? I think they should make a Jesus rule on social media. And I want to close with this quote from Jesus, because I think it's really important for how we interact with each other on the topic of justice. Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 1, it says this: "Do not judge, or you will be judged. For with the same judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So how can you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to notice the beam in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while there is a beam in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the beam out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give to dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before swine. If you do, they will trample them under your feet, and then turn and tear you to pieces." Thank you.